Beautiful day in New York, and with us, politics and journalism professor at Morgan State University, politics editor at the Griot, and MSNBC political contributor Jason Johnson. Also with us, U.S. national editor at the Financial Times, Ed Luce, who writes in his latest piece that, quote, Trump's grip on the Republican Party is still growing. Quote, Trump showed that in 2016 that embracing big government was no obstacle to becoming his party's nominee. The libertarian impulse is barely perceptible among today's Republican voters, many of whom are happy with Bidenomics. The party's energy is thus increasingly spent on cultural resentment. The party will sound as if it reviles Wall Street, even as it blocks attempts to raise the capital gains tax. It will be anti-corporate in word, but pro-billionaire indeed. Blue collar on the airwaves, but protective of offshore tax shelters in practice. The party of law and order that insists the 2020 election was stolen. Were Biden to stand down in 2024, Republicans would find it easier to depict Harris or almost any other candidate as the, quote, anti-American Democrat they crave. Trump looks likely to hang around for just such an opening. And Ed, here's a line. The party's energy is thus increasingly spent on cultural resentment. More than half of Republican voters support the use of force to defend, quote, the traditional American way of life, which, of course, is a radical departure from the traditional American way of life.
It is indeed. I mean, if you look back on why Trump lost, there's one of two ways you can go. The obvious way, the commonsensical way, would be that the man himself was the problem, that he managed to generate a higher turnout amongst Democrats in places such as Georgia, which you've been discussing, and that therefore he needs to be replaced, and the lessons of Trump's gross aberrations need to be learned. The other way of looking at it, which is the way the party has gone, is that January the 6th is basically fake news. It wasn't an insurrection. It's either been exaggerated or, in fact, it was an Antifa operation, a Ron Johnson sort of explanation for what happened on January the 6th. It was a radical left attempt to discredit Trump. And that's the way the party has gone. They had a moment after January the 6th and after Trump's second impeachment to pause, reappraise where the party was going and what it was. And they've squandered that moment. They've doubled down on Trump. Moderates like Rob Portman are not going to run again. Other moderates like Lisa Murkowski of Alaska are being challenged by Trumpians in the primary, Liz Cheney, of course. So the party is doubling down on Trump. And what does that mean? That means we're not going to get conservative critiques of deficit spending. You know, Trump clearly blew that up with his unfunded tax cut in 2017. We're going to get culture wars. We're going to get a much more sort of intense Trumpianism over the next couple of years and possibly beyond.
Jason Johnson, Jonathan Lemire is with us and has a question for you. Jonathan.
Hey, Jason, we're hearing more and more from the former president in the form of these press releases and emailed statements. They certainly don't have anywhere near the impact of his tweets, but he is clearly trying to stay viable, stay relevant, try to shape the party. But questions persist whether he actually will take the plunge and run again. And some of those close to him have their doubts, but no decision has been made. So let me ask you to survey the field. Let's take Ed's premise as right, and Trumpism is here to stay. But let's say it's not President Trump who takes the mantle. Who do you see within the party as inheriting that and going forward and emerging perhaps as the Trumpian candidate or candidates in 2024?
So I want to tackle another one of his premises, too. Joe Biden's not stepping down. I don't care if you have to play Weekend at Bernie's. Joe Biden is not going to step down from running for president in 2024 as long as he's remotely ambulatory. So I think this idea that the Republicans would be able to face off against Vice President Harris is kind of ridiculous at this point. It's either going to be DeSantis or it's going to be Josh Hawley, or I think Ted Cruz will actually run again. There are plenty of Trumpians that will come forward in 2024 and try and stake their claim. But what we have seen so far and Greetings in Missouri might be a good indicator of this, is that Trumpism doesn't seem to work for anybody long-term except Donald Trump. I may disagree with everything Donald Trump ever did. I may think that he was a white nationalist. I may think that he mismanaged COVID. I may think that he was corrupt. But he did have a certain charisma that none of these other Trumpians have. None of them do. Nobody likes Ted Cruz. Nobody trusts Josh Hawley. He reminds you of the kid who ran for student council president 12 times because he thought that would make him cool. And Donald Trump didn't have that. He had a candor that a lot of people really appreciated. So I see these other people trying, but I don't think any of them will be effective against Joe Biden, who I still believe will be the Democratic candidate in 2024.
Jason, I wanted to ask you about Georgia. We've been talking about it for about an hour and a half. There seems to be a debate among Georgia officials. Representative Thomas believed that Major League Baseball made the right decision. Of course, Stacey Abrams and the two Democratic senators said they thought that the All-Star Game should have stayed in Atlanta. I'm curious, what's your thought about MLB's decision and also about the debate in general around this Georgia law?
So this is, Joe, I'm glad you asked it because this is really, really important to understand, especially given what Greg Bluestein said and this notion of narratives. The top elected officials and wannabe elected officials in Georgia have said they don't want to boycott and they wish MLB didn't do it. Ossoff, Warnock, and Stacey Abrams have all said do not boycott Georgia. And this is not the only time they've said that. They told people not to boycott after the 2018 gubernatorial election, which Brian Kemp very likely rigged. So it needs to be very, very clear publicly that these elected officials aren't calling for this. That being said, the Republicans are, of course, going to try to blame the Democrats on it because it's Brian Kemp's fault. Brian Kemp knew people were unhappy about this. Brian Kemp knew that this was going to be a problem. And contextually, remember, this is the same guy who got into a fight with Delta 3 years ago about abortion laws, about guns. They seem to want to keep picking fights with the largest employers in the state. Now, as far as Major League Baseball goes, look, if they thought it was a bad idea to go to the state because of the politics around it, that's perfectly fine. We've seen that in North Carolina. We saw that about gay marriage with the NCAA in Illinois. We saw that with Major League Baseball in Arizona several years ago about immigration law. What these governors have to recognize is that playing politics with human rights actually annoys and offends sports leagues. And that's the consequence that they're facing here. This is not an argument about some simple partisan issue. This is a fundamental element of democracy. And I think that some of these national leagues have decided they're going to be good citizens. I think the Atlanta Braves were very dumb for sort of criticizing this decision. They probably should have just been quiet and said, hey, look, this is beyond our ability to control. But at some point, we have to recognize that this is the fault of Brian Kemp. Brian Kemp is desperate to keep his job because he knows that Harold Melton is probably going to primary him and beat him, and Brian Kemp wants to make sure that he stays in office. And I don't think he will, and no matter how many of these bills he tries to pull off, it doesn't mean he's going to save himself with a Republican Party that already thinks he's a betrayer to that which they worship, which is Donald Trump.
All right, Jason Johnson, as always, thanks a lot. We appreciate it.